Hello everyone, today we read and comment the 17th chapter of the 5th book of von Clausewitz Vom Kriege, its title being On Country and Ground. The text follows. Quite irrespective of their influence as regards the means of subsistence of an army, country and ground bear another most intimate and never-failing relation to the business of war, which is their decisive influence on the battle, both upon what concerns its course as well as upon the preparation for it and the use to be made of it. We now proceed to consider country and ground in this phase, that is, in the full meaning of the French expression terrain. The way to make use of them is a subject which lies mostly within the province of tactics, but the effects resulting from them appear in strategy. A battle in the mountains is, in its consequences as well as in itself, quite a different thing from a battle on a level plain. But until we have studied the distinction between offensive and defensive and examined the nature of each separately and fully, we cannot enter upon the consideration of the principal features of the ground in their effects. We must therefore, for the present, confine ourselves to an investigation of its general properties. There are three properties through which the ground has an influence on action in war, that is, as presenting an obstacle to approach, as an obstacle to an extensive view, and as a protection against the effect of firearms. All other effects may be traced back to these three. Unquestionably, this threefold influence of ground has a tendency to make warfare more diversified, more complicated, and more scientific, for there are plainly three more quantities which enter into military combinations. A completely level plain, quite open at the same time, that is, a tract of country which cannot influence war at all, has no existence except in relation to small bodies of troops, and with respect to them only for the duration of some given moment of time. When larger bodies are concerned and a longer duration of time, accidents of ground mix themselves up with the action of such bodies, and it is hardly possible in the case of a whole army to imagine any particular moment, such as a battle, when the ground would not make its influence felt. This influence is therefore never in abeyance, but it is certainly stronger or weaker according to the nature of the country. If we keep in view the great mass of topographical phenomena, we find that countries deviate from the idea of perfectly open level plains principally in three ways. First, by the form of the ground, that is, hills and valleys, then by woods, marshes, and lakes as natural features, and lastly by such changes as have been introduced by the hand of man. Through each of these three circumstances, there is an increase in the influence of ground on the operations of war. If we trace them up to a certain distance, we have mountainous country, a country little cultivated and covered with woods and marshes, and well cultivated. The tendency in each case is to render war more complicated and connected with art. The degree of influence which cultivation exercises is greater or less according to the nature of the cultivation. The system pursued in Flanders, Holstein, and some other countries where the land is intersected in every direction with ditches, dikes, hedges, and walls, interspersed with many single dwellings and small woods, has the greatest effect on war. The conduct of war is therefore of the easiest kind in a level, moderately cultivated country. This, however, only holds good in quite a general sense, leaving entirely out of consideration the use which the defensive can make of obstacles of ground. Each of these three kinds of ground has an effect in its own way on movement, on the range of sight, and in the cover it affords. In a thickly wooded country the obstacle to sight preponderates. In a mountainous country the difficulty of movement presents the greatest obstacle to an enemy. In countries very much cultivated, both these obstacles exist in a medium degree. As thick woods render great portions of ground in a certain manner impracticable for military movements, and as, besides the difficulty which they oppose to movement, they also obstruct the view, thereby preventing the use of means to clear a passage, the result is that they simplify the measures to be adopted on one side in proportion as they increase the difficulties with which the other side has to contend. Although it is difficult practically to concentrate forces for action in a wooded country, Still, a partition of forces does not take place to the same extent as it usually does in mountainous country or in a country very much intersected with canals, rivers, etc. In other words, the partition of forces in such a country is more unavoidable, but not so great. In mountains, the obstacles to movement preponderate and take effect in two ways, because in some parts the country is quite impassable, and where it is practicable we must move slower and with greater difficulty. On this account, the rapidity of all movements is much diminished in mountains, and all operations are mixed up with larger quantity of the element of time. But the ground in mountains has also the special property peculiar to itself that one point commands another. We shall devote the following chapter to the discussion of the subject of commanding heights generally, and shall only here remark that it is this peculiarity which causes the great partition of forces in operations carried on amongst mountains, for particular points thus acquire importance from the influence they have upon other points in addition to any intrinsic value which they have in themselves. As we have elsewhere observed, each of these three kinds of ground is in proportion has its own special peculiarity, has a tendency to an extreme, has in the same degree a tendency to lower the influence of the supreme command, increasing in like manner the independent action of subordinates down to the private soldier. The greater the partition of any force, the less of an undivided control is possible, so much the more are subordinates left to themselves, that is self-evident. Certainly, when the partition of a force is greater, then through the diversity of action and greater scope in the use of means, the influence of intelligence must increase, and even the commander-in-chief may show his talents to advantage under such circumstances. But we must here repeat what has been said before, that in war the sum of total single results decides more than the form or method in which they are connected, and therefore if we push our present considerations to an extreme case and suppose a whole army extended in a line of skirmishers so that each private soldier fights his own little battle, more will depend on the sum of single victories gained than on the form in which they are connected. For the benefit of good combinations can only follow from positive results, not from negative. Therefore, in such a case, the courage, the dexterity, and the spirit of individuals will prove decisive. It is only when the two opposing armies are on a par as regards military qualities, or that their peculiar properties hold the balance even, that the talent and judgment of the commander become again decisive. The consequence is that national armies and insurgent levies, etc., in which at least in the individual the warlike spirit is highly excited, although they are not superior in skill and bravery, are still able to maintain superiority by a great dispersion of their forces favored by a difficult country, and that they can only maintain themselves for a continuance upon that kind of system, because troops of this description are generally destitute of all the qualities and virtues which are indispensable when tolerably large numbers are required to act as a united body. Also in the nature of forces there are many gradations between one of these extremes and the other, for the very circumstance of being engaged in the defense of its own country gives to even a regular standing army something of the character of a national army, and makes it more suited for a war waged by an army broken up into detachments. Now, the more these qualifications and influences are wanting in an army, the greater they are on the side of its opponent, so much the more will it dread being split into fractions, the more it will avoid a broken country. But to avoid fighting in such a description of country is seldom a matter of choice. We cannot choose a theatre of war like a piece of merchandise from among several patterns, and thus we find generally that armies which from their nature fight with advantage in concentrated masses exhaust all their ingenuity in trying to carry out their system as far as possible in direct opposition to the nature of the country. They must in consequence submit to other disadvantages, such as scanty and difficult subsistence for the troops, bad quarters, and in the combat numerous attacks from all sides. But the disadvantage of giving up their own special advantage would be greater. These two tendencies in opposite directions, the one to concentration, the other to dispersion of forces, prevail more or less according as the nature of the troops engaged inclined them more to one side or the other, but however decided the tendency, the one side cannot always remain with his forces concentrated, neither can the other expect success by following his system of warfare in scattered bodies on all occasions. The French were obliged to resort to partitioning their forces in Spain, and the Spaniards, whilst defending their country by means of an insurgent population, were obliged to try the fate of great battles in the open field with part of their forces. Next, to the connection which country and ground have with the general, and especially with the political composition of the forces engaged, the most important point is the relative proportion of the three arms. In all countries which are difficult to traverse, whether the obstacles are mountains, forests, or a peculiar cultivation, a numerous cavalry is useless. That is plain in itself. It is just the same with artillery. In wooded countries there will probably be a want of room to use it with effect, of roads to transport it, and of forage for the horses. For this arm, highly cultivated countries are less disadvantageous, and at least of all a mountainous country. But no doubt about both, no doubt, afford cover against its fire, and that in respect they are unfavorable to an arm which depends entirely on its fire. Both also offer furnished means for the enemy infantry to place the heavy artillery in jeopardy, as infantry can pass everywhere. But still in neither is there in general any want of space for the use of a numerous artillery, and in mountainous countries it has this great advantage, that its effects are prolonged and increased in consequence of the movements of the enemy being slower. But it is undeniable that infantry has a decided advantage over every other arm in difficult country, and that therefore in such countries its number may considerably exceed the usual proportion. So this is a very interesting chapter, as all in the Vom Kriege, because it illustrates the differences that terrain makes ground countries called, specifically terrain, as von Clausewitz is putting out as the French expression that dominated military vocabulary at the time about the topic. In strategical terms, that is, of course, how do you employ your army given properly the ground? Here, though, extensively, right, up to, in fact, a strategical dimension that we already hinted at. The dichotomy here is that naturally the most powerful armies, the biggest ones, to make it more evident, as we have seen in the Vom Kriege, that by the beginning of the 19th century, all European armies fight the same way, fundamentally. So there can be dramatic differences in command or training, but fundamentally the formula is always identical. There's a lot of symmetry in there, in relative terms. And so the larger the army, the more you're obliged, literally here from Clausewitz makes it clear, that these are not things where you are going to fight physically is not to be foreseen clearly, especially the more war goes on compared to the previous plans. And the largest armies are going to mostly campaign in the flatlands where it can also be more easily supplied and so on. The smaller ones on terrain where they can compensate for their weakness, their relative weakness, by putting a difficulty at obliging the enemy to fragment and to hopefully catch enemy in detail, but still occupying a territory at that point that is less rich and less important, strategically speaking, on average, than the flatlands, where the most important centers are. So, as always, there is this dichotomy that doesn't find a solution. Like, there's not properly one thing that is better than another, right? It's just knowing that there is this interaction that is to be exploited when you are in it, according to these guidelines. We will see more in detail what this is about. So, on country and ground, Clausewitz says, quite irrespective of their influence as regards the means of subsistence of an army, country and ground bear another most intimate and never-fading relation to the business of war, which is their decisive influence on the battle, that is, here, where you are going to fight, right, both upon what it concerns its course, that is, how it's fought, right, as well as upon the preparation for it, and the use to be made of it. So here actually we range from the tactical to the strategical, so everything. Of course, the terrain is the protagonist of combat, but more it influences at a broader level. And for Clausewitz says, we now proceed to consider countering ground in this phase, that is, in the full meaning of the French expression terrain. And von Clausewitz says, the way to make use of them is a subject which lies mostly within the province of tactics, but the effects resulting from them appear in strategy. A battle in the mountains is, in its consequences as well as in itself, quite a different thing from the battle on a level plain. But until we have studied the distinction between offensive and defensive and examined the nature of each separately and fully, we cannot enter upon the consideration of the principal features of the ground in their effects. This is something we will analyze eventually. But we must therefore, von Clausewitz says, for the present confine ourselves to an investigation of its general properties. So here we don't analyze literally what you might expect in the, not just in the strategic, in the operational sense, or the strategical, but at a tactical level, observing how this impacts in defense, in attack or defense. But still, there are certain essentials that are connected to the terrain we have to be wary of. For Clausewitz says there are three properties through which the ground has an influence on action in war. That is, as presenting an obstacle to approach, as an obstacle to an extensive view, and as protection against the effect of firearms. All other effects may be traced back to these three, right? So this has to do with properly the problem of pushing through a territory to see what you're getting through, and especially where you can target the enemy given this terrain feature or not. Von Clausewitz says, unquestionably, this threefold influence of ground has a tendency to make warfare more diversified, more complicated, and more scientific, for they are plainly three more quantities which enter into military combinations. A completely level plain, quite open at the same time. Excuse me, I wanted to comment this last phrase. Here, in the meaning of scientific stands naturally for the positive, planning of a military action in relation to these to these terrain features, right? That is banally, I don't know. An above ground position is more difficult to attack when it's held by the enemy, and consequently he will have it easier to defend it. Is this always true? Yes, it is always true. But the fact that this is true doesn't mean that there are other factors that do not come to interplay, so that maybe, even if there is that absolute advantage in relative terms, you may not want to occupy that ground for another reason. Not just because it may be still exposed to overwhelming enemy force that supersedes the advantage given by gravity to your position, but specifically because you may, but for example, actually, you may need those troops somewhere else, right? So at that moment, and therefore that renders the advantage really relative. But you have to take it into account, and also these factors interplay, right? So continuing, von Clausewitz was saying, a completely level plain, quite open at the same time, that is a tract of country which cannot influence war at all, has no existence except in relation to the small bodies of troops and with respect to them only for the duration of some given moment of time. Why? Because a perfect flat land, which is normally what, on YouTube you find is people, what if you have, perfect flat land, right? So where can troops fight and which wins between the two, right? It's okay, you can make that case, but the question is how frequently is that going to present itself, and especially how much it's precisely gonna fit, the actual problems of a real campaign or a real battle. So what von Clausewitz is telling us is that, you can find pretty flat areas, but the point is that those are gonna look like that and influence combat or better, not influence in it, as we've seen, because of this flattening, literally, of these scientific factors you could exploit on the field. But for small units, because it's for 10 soldiers you may find that flatland. For 100 soldiers, still maybe, even for 1,000. But the question, when the size is going to increase, you're going to stretch over you're going to stand in a much larger territory that is obviously not a perfect flat, geometrically flat plane, right? So it's impossible for you to think that every ground is the same, that you can even find that ground that is actually a perfect flatland. Because go out there in reality, find me a perfect flatland. There is really not. And here terrain can mean literally everything, right? It doesn't have to be, it can even, as we will see, Von Clausewitz speaks of also artificial elements of landscape, such as canals, for example, ditches, and so on. So these are also man-made, and you have got to take it into account in the general, in this general scientific economy of how you can exploit the battlefield. Von Clausewitz says, when larger bodies are concerned and a longer duration of time, because time is also variable here, and therefore troops move on the ground, the ground changes. So accidents of ground mix themselves up with the action of such bodies, and it is hardly possible in the case of a whole army to imagine any particular moment, such as a battle, when the ground would not make its influence felt. That is to say, also, indirectly, if a larger, the more important the military operation, and the more the ground is going to play in this, because of not just properly even here the ideal movements that troops can make on the field, but literally because the army as a complex system is going to be disordered by even small variations that can cause changes within the internal structure of the army that you can't properly even foresee, right? This will be explored by von Clausewitz in the concept of attrition, that even from a small, fault of terrain, you can have, that can produce a major consequences that maybe not even to be spotted on the long run, and you can't properly calculate even when the mass happened. You don't know where it started from. It can be that, it can be something else, right? But it does happen. It always plays, and physically speaking, this messes up things enormously, and that's just terrain, right? It's not counting the enemy. It's the person who is going to do everything in order to kill you. Much better than terrain, and so von Clausewitz says this influence is therefore never in abeyance, but it's certainly stronger or weaker according to the nature of the country. If we keep in view the great mass of topographical phenomena, we find that countries deviate from the idea of perfectly open level plains principally in three ways. First, by the form of the ground, that is, hills and valleys. Then by woods, marshes, and lakes as natural features, and lastly by such changes as have been introduced by the hand of man. Through each of these three circumstances there is an increase in the influence of ground on the operations of war. If we trace them up to a certain distance, we have mountainous country, a country little cultivated and covered with woods and marshes, and the well cultivated. The tendency in each case is to render war more complicated and connected with art. So what von Clausewitz is saying is telling us is that you're obviously going to exploit this terrain features. It's actually one of the most natural, and if you want, can say less difficult in absolute terms, but it kind of, it's kind of understandable when you look at the battlefield, more or less what are the advantages that a position can give you. Right, the problem is not much calculating the terrain, but all what happens eventually over it, right, in terms of arms and in armies and in general. So the question here is, however, realizing that the interaction with terrain is something that changes over time, and for the troops, they simply are going to cross over it. Von Clausewitz says the degree of influence which cultivation exercises is greater or less according to the nature of the cultivation. The system pursued in Flanders, Holstein, and some other countries where the land is interested in every direction with ditches, dikes, hedges, and walls, interspersed with many single dwellings and small woods, has the greatest effect on war. Right? Just brief note. I don't know if you've ever read a military map. I mean, the actual ones used by the military, they obviously indicate even what kind of cultivation is on the spot, because the troops have to recognize it immediately during, when they're there after the briefing. So the Von Clausewitz says the conduct of war is therefore of the easiest kind in a level, moderately cultivated country. This, however, only holds good in quite a general sense, leaving entirely out of consideration the use which the defensive can make of obstacles of ground. Right. So that in relative terms, of course, actually in absolute terms, you can do great things, even in a moderately cultivated country, right? Exploiting the ground features. Just generally, you have to take into consideration that you may not be in the condition, you may not be on the spot, right? At that point, you may not, the enemy will, the enemy understands whether a position is more or less advantageous, right? And it's not that war is fought just by on the base of those principles. They play a part, but of course there's always a risk involved, right? There's always generally proportionality, is to say, advantageous positions are normally, you want to exploit them, but they also confer an advantage that can make you employ other forces elsewhere with more, possibility of interaction and effectiveness and art in that sense, strategically speaking. So the point here is flexible. And it always depends also on these changes. That is to say, a spot on the ground can become advantageous or disadvantageous in the same course of the battle for whatever is going to happen. So Von Clausewitz says each of these three kinds of ground has an effect in its own way on movement, on the range of sight, and the cover it affords. In a thickly wooded country, the obstacle to sight preponderates. In a mountainous country, the difficulty of movement presents the greatest obstacle to an enemy. In countries very much cultivated, both these obstacles exist in a medium degree. This is kind of self-evident. Von Clausewitz says, as thick woods render great positions of ground in a certain manner impracticable for military movements, and as besides the difficulty which they oppose to movement, they also obstruct the view, thereby preventing the use of means to clear a passage, the result is that they simplify the measures to be adopted on one side in proportion as they increase the difficulties which the other side has to contend. Although it is difficult practically to concentrate forces for action in a wooded country, still a partition of forces does not take place in the same extent as it usually does in a mountainous country, in a country very much intersected with canals, rivers. In other words, the partition of forces in such a country is more unavoidable, but not so great. Because of course, it's not that all the country is going to be covered with these things, and still, as we've seen, there are, first of all, consider that the larger the armies are, in a sense, they are capable of overcoming the obstacles. This is at least, for especially consider the artificial obstacles, man-made ones, right? It's obvious that there are certain complications. You have to cross a river or a ridge, whatever. That is not something you can take lightly, and that makes a big strategical difference, usually in the circumstances. But at the same time, these obstacles on the ground are never kind of the most important thing, right? It also depends on the types of armies, how they are employed. It's obvious that, but even in here we could be puzzled by seeing how certain things do not change extremely, even in historical terms. I mean, mountain warfare is obviously now different for, if you take it, abstractly from logistical difficulties, etc. They always pose similar difficulties in a sense, but there are other means to supersede them that are also more radical sometimes, but whatever. You may not want to use them in a way. Then von Clausewitz says, in mountains, the obstacles to movement preponderate and take effect in two ways, because in some parts the country is quite impassable, and where it is practicable we must move slower and with greater difficulty. On this account, the rapidity of all movements is much diminished in mountains, and all operations are mixed up with a larger quantity of the element of time. But the ground in mountains has also the special property peculiar to itself that one point commands another. We shall devote the following chapter to the discussion of the subject of commanding heights generally, and shall only here remark that it is this peculiarity which causes the great partition of forces in operations carried on amongst mountains, for particular points thus acquire importance from the influence they have upon other points in addition to an intrinsic value which they have in themselves. This is a very actually important topic, and we will in fact analyze it where von Clausewitz says he does, and but it's fantastic. I don't know if you ever tried to solve a tactical solution when there are actually these various points in height. It's one of the most important things, right? And when you are on the ground, you see it very clearly. But anyhow, this von Clausewitz is telling us is that it's not just a matter of on mountain warfare, a matter of, and this is valid actually for any other situation, but on mountains this is more pronounced, a matter of the actual physical difficulty of getting up the mountain. But it's literally considering that the enemy can pour a hell of fire from the top of it, but also on other heights, right? And this conditions in practice ever more the options that you have to act, right? It forces you to split forces in a way to pass, for example, through a certain choking point that of course you can't pass through enormous amount of forces all at once. So it has a deep strategical impact at the end of the day. Von Clausewitz says, as we have elsewhere observed, each of these three kinds of ground in proportion has as its own special peculiarity, has a tendency to an extreme, has in the same degree a tendency to lower the influence from the supreme command, increasing in like manner the independent action of subordinates down to the private soldier. The greater the partition of any force, the less an undivided control is possible, so much the more are subordinates left to themselves. That is self-evident. Certainly, when the partition of a force is greater, then through the diversity of action and greater scope in the use of means, the influence of intelligence must increase, and even the commander-in-chief may show his talents to advantage under such circumstances. But we must here repeat what has been said before, that in war the sum total of single results decides more than the form or method in which they are connected, and therefore if we push our present considerations to an extreme case and suppose a whole army extended in a line of skirmishers so that each private soldier fights his own battle, more will depend on the sum of single victories gained than on the form in which they are connected, right? For the benefit of good combinations can only follow from positive results, not from negative, right? Therefore, in such a case, the courage, the dexterity, the spirit of individuals will prove decisive. It is only when two opposing armies are on a par as regards military qualities, or that their peculiar properties hold the balance even, that the talent and judgment of the commander become again decisive. The consequence is that national armies and insurgent levies, etc., in which, at least in the individual, the warlike spirit is highly excited, although they are not superior in skill and bravery, are still able to maintain a superiority by a great dispersion of the forces favored by a difficult country, and that they can only maintain themselves for a continuance upon the kind of system, because troops of this description are generally destitute of all the qualities and virtues which are indispensable when tolerably large numbers are required to act as a united body. Bit of a long paragraph, but crucial, right? Here, fundamentally, von Clausewitz explains that what matters in war in terms of destruction of the enemy is literally it. Right, this is something we observed in the previous books, and the war is made to literally take out the enemy forces, right? It has the objective of to force the enemy to fulfill your will, but at the end of the day, it passes through the physical destruction of the enemy, right? That is not the objective of war per se, but in order to convince the enemy, that pressure, if you want, the destruction is fundamental. So what von Clausewitz is saying here is something very subtle and very important to understand war. That is to say, that has to do with the concept of also of doctrine, right? In the idea how do we fight a war, and practically speaking, how do we destroy that enemy? Well, von Clausewitz is connecting this in relation to the difficulties of terrain by explaining that terrain forces to split us to split forces because it's impracticable for a greater wall. Basically, the autonomy of the various components of the army increases. So if we were to make, as von Clausewitz made here, the extreme example, so as if we basically had the army all deployed in a line where it's just individual soldiers that fight all out there by themselves against an equivalent in the front of them. Objectively, the result of that combat will depend on the individual bravery of those soldiers, right? Imagining that these soldiers do not quite support each other, so it's a sort of a sum of individual fights. We've seen this, speaking of the combat units, back in, if I'm not wrong, it was the second chapter or the third, I don't remember. And von Clausewitz observes that therefore, in spite doctrine and when we fight tactically and strategically prearranged fashion, we have came up with a plan to fundamentally use combined arms. These are what really make the difference in warfare on average, in sheer absolute amount, right? Individuals are weaker when they don't act in combination with others. Collective training is superior to individual training, and that's why civilization passed through this, right? That's why we're soldiers, we're not warriors. And in spite of the disgusting revival of the term for purely ideological reasons, just in some, I don't even, that they're not properly intellectual environments, they're just, bad environments of some sort. Sometime we'll explain that too. This obsession with individualism of the war it's literally a regression in civilization and in the outlook of individuals on it. Right? This, if anything, proves what individuals normally tend to think, that it doesn't matter in war, how organized you are, how much you're trained, of how much you're, intensely habituated to fight in combination of arms and so on. And no, it's about the individuals, how brave, how strong you are. This is not true, right? This is false, and that's why that model doesn't exist anymore, because the people who pursued that died, in the sense that they were killed by those who knew how to do better. And that's what war truly is and has always been, because men historically and prehistorically have never fought individually, right? Or better, their individuality has always been superseded by the collectivity of it in every kind of clash, right? Even the prehistorical ones. There's never been anything like heroic warfare as we have idealized it like. There's always been a rating, there's always been a combined tactics and so on. And that's called intelligence. That's why you don't even render justice to some imaginary scapegoat we use here to call as the warriors, if there has ever been a warrior was, fighting alone. Never existed. But von Clausewitz is telling something that when that what truly matters in these circumstances where you're obliged to split forces is that therefore the individuality can't compensate for that collectivity. Why? Because if you split forces, that collectivity decreases. That's why guerrilla is so effective, and that's why it is not in the open, in the flatlands, but usually in disgusting territories like forests, mountains, where it's a nightmare to even think to fight in, right? Because there you can exploit the asymmetry scientifically, right, by ambushing, by placing yourself on the top of somewhere that you have an immediate advantage. But at the same time, as we've seen from a strategical point of view, this, guerrilla I will see it better now, is a declaration of inferiority. I mean, it's the declaration that you do not have the means to fight in the open, and the ultimate objective of wearing out the enemy through that is that, however, to take on the initiative at some point, to come out and mass and knock out the enemy, because otherwise, yes, you can achieve a victory in considering all the various possibilities can happen in there just by wearing the enemy out like that, but militarily speaking, nobody weakens the enemy sensibly. At some point, will keep on fighting guerrilla when he can have the upper hand by concentrating the forces that he has and can knock him out, because it's simply more advantageous, more intelligent, and more effective to literally kill the enemy. And that's why also the problem of the warrior, the question of why people do not understand practically that individuality has a lower importance than collectivity in war, because they think it's once again it's the warrior that has the courage and has the skill. No, because that kind of thing, when it gets into real war, is the first thing to be wiped out if it behaves like that, right? And but again, still, to put it simply, the annihilation of the enemy passes through the sheer act of annihilation. So it doesn't matter here whether this is accomplished by combined arms or individuality. The importance is that it happens like that, right? So killed or in a way or in another, still, of course, taking into account that this is going to have some effect. I mean, how much did it cost to kill the enemy in that way? That obviously influences your capacity, your strategical capacity to carry it out. So it's always reciprocal, it's always moving, it's always flexible, but still it's the most important thing. That is the sum of those combat units that will make, at the end of the day, the outcome, right? So Von Clausewitz says, even if we fielded hundreds of thousands of men arrayed in a skirmish mode, fighting individually against one opponent in front of him and isolated from the rest, still, the result will come out from how much they have been able to annihilate each other that way. Why we don't fight like that is in concentrated forces and with strict interaction between armies, is that is a much more effective way to wipe out more enemies at a single moment, right? That any individual can do by himself. But it's important in here for the sake of terrain, exactly because terrain forces you to exploit that opportunity when it presents it you. That is to say, when you're to be cornered in a tougher terrain is usually not a strategical, flawed strategical situation, but still tactically you have the opportunity to not to necessarily overthrow the situation, because also the enemy sees, as we were saying before, that when there is an advantage or a disadvantage, but it can help you actually kill more people in that way than you would have been able to do in the open on average, right? That still may not be enough for you to be in a disgusting situation, but still the enemy can suffer more from it. And this tendency is easy to exploit also in the sense that the larger the enemy is, and the more therefore he corners you and obliges you to fight on such a terrain, and the greater the chance that he is going to lose in absolute terms more than you, right? In the sense that it's way more difficult to control more men and to pretend that they're going, that you as a commander are going to take choices that are caring individually about every single one of them, as the commander that instead is commanding, is at the head of a guerrilla commando that of skilled veterans that is there to maximize the effects of an enemy, of the enemy losses, or better, to maximize the enemy losses. So I don't know if you understand the point here, but the point is that there is always an opportunity that this dichotomy balances itself out, and normally that's why also the ideal theoretical clashes on an even terrain or a more complicated terrain are a bit senseless, because in reality armies are not going to fight in a situation that is particularly disadvantageous, right? And especially in a tactical situation, that's much easier to understand, right? It's something you can measure almost, right? And therefore requires also much less skill than strategical ones. That's why also, however, the strategic level is, let's say, it's if you want to, you're more forced to fight in whichever it is, but at the same time can hide more surprises, right? Even if tactically speaking you can actually perform more, it's easier to surpass the average outcome, but still the strategical consequences are so large and sometimes so unknown that, yeah, you may do good at some level, but you may completely ignore another that is taking place. You may not have the time to fix the situation before you get wiped out in this sense. So that's why war is, one of the reasons, right? One of the corollaries of war is not a deterministic system. Why there is no such thing, this war will go this way, will have this outcome, because that's less true than in any other human situation, probably, especially considering times and spaces involved in the way it's taking place, right? I hope I explained myself decently, but there is much to expand on this, and we will be talking about this the more we progress with the Vom Kriege. Then von Clausewitz says, also in the nature of forces there are many gradations between one of these extremes and the other, for the very circumstance of being engaged in the defense of its own country gives to even a regular standing army something of the character of a national army, and makes it more suited for a war waged by an army broken up into detachments. Now, because of course guerrilla is fighting, as we've seen, in a condition of inferiority that, however, is physical in a sense, is material, right? But still it's compensated by a higher moral force. That is to say, you are more motivated than to emerge in the first place for wanting to fight in that condition of asymmetry, of disadvantage, so that you can arrive to or you're obliged to compensate for that situation, for the motives that have brought you to rise in arms, right? That's why it's so important, and that's where also the individual capacity takes over in certain circumstances. Von Clausewitz says, now the more these qualifications and influences are wanting in an army, the greater they are on the side of its opponent, so much the more will it dread being split into fractions, the more it will avoid a broken country. But to avoid fighting in such a description of country is seldom a matter of choice. We cannot choose a theatre of war like a piece of merchandise from among several patterns, and thus we find generally that armies which from their nature fight with advantage in concentrated masses exhaust all their ingenuity in trying to carry out their system as far as possible in direct opposition to the nature of the country. They must, in consequence, submit to other disadvantages, such as canny and difficult subsistence for the troops, bad quarters, and in combat numerous attacks from all sides, but the disadvantage of giving up their own special advantage would be greater, right? This is important. It gives you a dimension of this kind of fight, right? The advantages of a large force are exactly the ones provided by the concentration of mass, right? But this concentration of mass is, as we've seen, more or less suited to the terrain, and you don't choose often where you're going to fight. So sometimes you're obliged to cope with that. It's like coping with guerrilla at that point. You have necessarily to fight in another sense. And larger armies that are fighting out there in the open are obviously have an advantage that they maintain, and it is so evident, so concrete, and that's why it overwhelms the individual out there, because it's being demonstrated directly by the sheer amount of cost that keeping such an enormous army has, right? So that's the difference between collective and individual strength. Because the force that brings an army of hundreds of thousands to fight in another country, invade, to attack, is enormously larger than the force that, a guy that wants to rise in arms against an invader can have. Doesn't matter how effective it can be, but it's going to be superseded, and that's why we fight with large armies, and guerrilla is just a secondary thing that, contrarily to what is believed in some defeatistic Western environment, is actually crushed, right? History is a constant show of how guerrilla, at the end of the day, can go on and on, yes, but still somebody, if there is such a thing, it's because somebody has occupied your country. and it's still there, and it remains over and over again. So it's not much guerrilla that goes over and over again, but it's, the big guns that when arrive are able to do things that that these other locals have not been able to do, and that's what they are conquered, invaded, and like that, right? And the reasons why guerrilla at the end of the day makes the thing is not because of much of the mechanics of it, right? But because there is a political balance there that is more important. That is what makes actually war an instrument, and that therefore, it's ridiculous to think that some of the greatest powers in the history of mankind were defeated actually because they wouldn't have the strength to actually get rid of that guerrilla. But the point is that there is a context, a broader context, that is, why would they have spent all those money if, they could have invested somewhere else where it would have been more profitable? That's the reason why certain lands were not invaded. That's the reason why, not because they had a particular importance. On the contrary, right? They had a lower one, and therefore already the invaders were not pretty convinced about it. Then, the local guerrilleros made it, wars, so they say, okay, we're out of here. But in a sense, it's much easier to balance that defeat those powers in open ground. What you want to have to keep up a larger country that is rich, that is florid, than that once occupied is going to remain forever under someone's control. So this idea, we weren't conquered, we managed to overthrow the invader. Yeah, but it depends, right? It's not that's not an achievement. Some are the greatest achievements in the annals of military history, but at the same time, consider that that is the measure of the resolve of the scale of that local reality, not of the broader one that could encompass an empire that maybe controlled great part of the known world, right? So, of course, everybody has its motives to fight, and that's exactly the point. Guerrilla worked historically where there were the conditions to make it work, and that was a pretty brilliant and actually hard form of war, right? It's not a light one, right? In spite the effects can be, it's really harsh, it's really intense. We'll talk more about this because it's actually an important topic that has to do with the concept of asymmetry that defines, as we were explaining in that series on the meaning of victory, technically what the outcome of a war is. There is no such absolute outcome of a war in the sense that you can concretely measure it. Everybody has a different resolve of a war. There are wars that, morally speaking, can be lost by everybody. I mean, the Vietnam War, let's be honest about it, everybody lost there. Right? It's not that the Vietnamese, they wish they had seen the end of that with the end of the war. That what came later was possibly even worse, right? And so the question is, look at political narratives in history, because you're often being told of things just because somebody has pontificated on it for some relative subjective reasons, and that doesn't mean that what actually happened isn't more encouraging, more important, more useful to know than it seems, because that can incidentally help you to fight other wars later, first of all, but also makes you understand why that is the case, where war is actually playing on, and where how politics informs that. And we should really talk about this in the future. But it's really an important concept. It's one of the most important ones, and in the Vom Kriege we will surely talk more about this. So Clausewitz says, these two tendencies in opposite directions, the one to concentration, the other to dispersion of forces, prevail more or less according as nature of the troops engaged incline them more to one side or the other. But however decided the tendency, the one side cannot always remain with his forces concentrated, neither can the other expect success by following his system of warfare in scattered bodies on all occasions. This is exactly what we were saying. It's not that there is the big guy with the big army out there can remain there forever fighting like that, or that's a fixed thing. Or it's not that the guy who makes guerrilla can fight ever like this forever, right, and not exploiting other situations. Von Clausewitz makes the example of Spain during the Napoleonic War, says the French were obliged to resort to partitioning their forces in Spain, and the Spaniards, whilst defending their country by means of an insurgent population, were obliged to try the fate of great battles in the open field with part of their forces. Obviously, it's what we were saying before. War is never, sclerotic in this sense. If you fight with guerrillas because you hope at some point you're gonna seize more and more resources from the enemy, and you can field a force that is capable of matching them in open field, and that's not wars. That's exactly the power of combined arms that makes it greater than what guerrilla can do, right? But it has to start from, eroding the enemy from even at a lower level, but managing to recompact a greater force to strike more impactingly than saying guerrilla can. So it's obvious that you can't go on forever. It's not a standard mode. War follows these patterns in the sense that it changes. It changes asymptotically on the base of the circumstances, of the needs, of the contingencies. Von Clausewitz says, next to the connection which country and ground have with the general, and especially with the political composition of the forces engaged, the most important point is the relative proportion of the three arms. Von Clausewitz says, in all countries which are difficult to traverse, whether the obstacles are mountains, forests, or a peculiar cultivation, a numerous cavalry is useless. Right? Cavalry needs an open plain. That is plain itself. It is just the same with artillery in wooded countries. You can't transport artillery in wooded countries. There will probably be a want of room to use it, with effect of roads to transport it and of forage for the horses. For this arm, highly cultivated countries are less disadvantageous, at least of all a mountainous country, right? Because in a mountainous country, artillery can hammer the enemy like crazy, exploiting gravity and this longer range and so on. The problem is actually bringing artillery on there, but you can do it, and the advantage deriving from that ultimate position is being worth the effort. And Von Clausewitz says, both no doubt afford cover against its fire. In that respect they are unfavorable to an arm which depends entirely on its fire. Both also furnish means for an enemy's infantry to place the heavy artillery in jeopardy, as infantry can pass anywhere, but still in neither is there in general any want of space for the use of numerous artillery, and in mountainous country it has this great advantage, that its effects are prolonged and increased in consequence of the movements of the enemy being slower, because the enemy is also naturally more that's where position warfare actually comes from, because you try not to even expose yourself to that disadvantage of artillery shooting you from the bow, right? You're going to try to find other solutions to go gradually. But everything gets more slower, at least. But it is undeniable, Von Clausewitz says, that the infantry has a decided advantage over every other arm in difficult country, and that therefore in such country number may considerably exceed the usual proportion. Of course, infantry increases in importance on more difficult terrain. This is obvious because it can crawl more or less everywhere, differently from cavalry or artillery, right? And this is also self-evident. And this chapter is interesting because it gives you a plastic dimension of literally the flexible. I mean, the fact that you can't properly choose more than much this kind of setting. That there are political and strategical reasons for which you're going to fight in a certain place that go beyond what you actually wish or want. But that's why you have to stay prepared how to cope with that, and what are the advantages and disadvantages that you can exploit just for knowing them. Alright, so for now we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.